The first tendrils of dawn barely pierced the heavy curtains, yet Alara was already stirring, not by choice, but by the insistent familiar ache that had become her unwelcome morning companion. It wasn't a sharp pain, more a deep, unyielding stiffness, a concrete pore setting overnight in her joints. Her knees, in particular, felt like rusted hinges, protesting even the slightest shift beneath the duvet, while her lower back, a constant, dull throb, reminded her of its weary existence. A weary sigh escaped her, a sound heavy with the weight of unfulfilled movement. Getting old, she'd often mutter to the silent room, the phrase a self-fulfilling prophecy she clung to with a strange resignation. 48, she'd muse, was the age when the body started sending eviction notices, when the graceful fluidity of youth dissolved into this daily, grinding discomfort. It wasn't just age, though. She attributed most of it to the relentless march of time. Years hunched over a keyboard, coaxing spreadsheets into submission in her data analysis job, had sculpted her posture into a permanent question mark. 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, her body was a forgotten statue, rigid and unmoving, only to be jolted into reluctant action each morning. The frustration was a dull ache beneath the physical one. She yearned for the ease of movement she remembered, a body that didn't demand a negotiation simply to get out of bed. Yet, the thought of actually doing something about it felt like an insurmountable mountain. Every article, every well-meaning friend pointed to intense exercise, high-impact cardio, grueling strength training, hours of sweat and strain. That was the only way, wasn't it? But where was the time, the energy, the sheer, unadulterated will? It felt utterly out of reach, a luxury for those with limitless reserves, leaving her trapped in this cycle of stiffness and weary resignation, convinced this was simply her future. It was during one particularly stiff afternoon, her lower back screaming in silent protest from hours hunched over her screen, that Alara first truly saw Arthur. He was a fixture in their department, a man in his late 60s, perpetually cheerful, who moved with a surprising, almost unsettling ease. While Alara felt every joint creak as she shifted, Arthur would lean back in his chair, a seemingly unconscious, fluid rotation of his shoulders rippling through his frame. He'd stretch an arm out, not in a grand gesture, but a gentle extension, his fingers flexing before returning to his keyboard. Later, she noticed him subtly tilting his head, a slow, almost imperceptible arc that seemed to unwind the tension from his neck, or tapping his feet beneath his desk, a rhythmic, gentle motion that somehow looked less like fidgeting and more like deliberate, quiet engagement. Intrigued, Alara found herself observing him more closely over the next few days. It wasn't exercise as she knew it. There were no grunts, no sweat, no dedicated blocks of time. It was a continuous, almost meditative dance of micro-movements woven seamlessly into his day. One afternoon, catching her gaze as he gently rotated his wrists, Arthur offered a warm smile. "Stiffness isn't just about age, Alara," he said, his voice soft. "It's often about stagnation. Blood needs to flow. Joints need their lubrication. Think of a rusty gate. It's not the age, it's the lack of movement." He continued, "Most people wait until they're in pain to move, or they think movement has to be strenuous. But it's the consistent, gentle nudges throughout the day that make the real difference. I call it micro-mobility. Tiny stretches, subtle rotations, shifting your weight. It keeps the channels open." Ilara, initially skeptical, her mind still clinging to images of high-intensity workouts, felt a flicker of something else. Could it truly be that simple? A simple, almost effortless approach, so vastly different from the daunting regimens she'd always associated with well-being. A tiny, fragile seed of possibility began to sprout in the weary landscape of her resignation. The seed Arthur planted took root, fragile at first, then surprisingly resilient. Ilara, almost apologetically, began her micro-mobility experiment. During long video calls, her ankles performed gentle circles beneath the desk, a discreet rebellion against stillness. She'd stretch her neck slowly, side to side, during a particularly dull presentation, feeling the subtle tension melt from her shoulders. Every hour, she made it a point to stand, roll her shoulders back, and arch her spine, a silent, almost imperceptible dance of liberation. The changes were subtle at first, a whisper rather than a shout, a creak less here, a smoother pivot there. But gradually, the whispers grew louder. The stubborn morning stiffness, once a familiar, painful embrace, began to loosen its grip. Instead of groaning out of bed, Ilara found herself rising with a fraction more ease, her joints protesting less. Her energy levels, once a fluctuating tide, became a steady, gentle current throughout the day. The mental fog that often clouded her afternoons started to lift, replaced by a clarity and focus she hadn't experienced in years. The profound realization dawned on her during a particularly vibrant walk in the park, her steps light, her breath even. I don't need intense exercise, she thought, a joyous revelation blossoming in her chest. I just need to move regularly, gently, consistently. It wasn't about pushing limits or conquering pain. It was about coaxing life back into her body, one small, deliberate movement at a time. Ilara embraced her newfound mobility with a profound sense of gratitude. She felt younger, not just physically, but in spirit. She began sharing her simple regimen with colleagues and friends, her eyes sparkling with an infectious vitality. The world, once a series of static demands, now felt like an open invitation. She moved through her days with a quiet grace, a gentle, flowing energy that was her own unique awakening. The channels were open, and life, once stagnant, now flowed freely.